Okay, we are recording.
Yeah. So the what is for the people we just pressed recording. What we were talking about before was just this sense of um, what you and John have been working with, and I've been loving reading. I, I Anytime you want to include me on the stuff that you're writing in Google Docs or whatever.
Oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
I tend to
just
be,
I like reading through it, but just the sense of this what you've been talking about with the distinction suchness and the moreness,
Mhm.
right?
Which is
And
John's, I should say properly. Like that particular way of formulating it is
right.
that's all John. Yeah.
In that sense of where it's like it's definitely my experience of where with circling of going so deep into someone's suchness, and right in that moment, it's almost as if you could talk about the infinity of the cosmos, right? Because what you're so present to and present by, right? Like it's so on one level, so intimately the unique something that you conceive, right, uh, of them, and what that does. On one level, it's like very, 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 very personal. But at the same time, it's like so easy to like scale totally up and talk about infinity, right? And then to switch back that there's something about dialogos um, when it's really genuine and presents itself that just seems to bring both of those together, right? In
Mm-hmm.
such a way. And you were saying like, a lot of, and actually with bunch of our conversations is talking about this phenomena of, where you don't feel like it or whatever mood, right? You're predisposed over, right? Does
I
not, it's
myself
like,
talking about that a lot lately. I wonder what that says.
right, the last thing you want to do is be around people and talk to somebody or whatever.
Yeah.
And then like this experience of just kind of in a certain sense, surrendering your will to the activity. And at some point it catches, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you, your will actually catches and it becomes given by the activity and go into a flow state.
Yeah.
And then you said this thing that was really interesting is like, I bet in the more that you experience dialogos, right, in that possibility, the harder and harder it is to say no to dialogos, right?
Mm-hmm.
That even if you can't feel it, right, barely remember it, right, that that if you just show up and you start engaging, right, that if like fate permits, like it'll cast its spell on you, which you want it to. Um,
Absolutely. It's
but
what brings a lot of people to church every week, is that precise
yeah,
feeling, I think. Obviously we're
exactly,
talking about orders of magnitude of difference here, but fundamentally I think it's the same kind of phenomena.
exactly.
Yeah.
So just thinking about the pup that, in some level there's and and I just want to put this in your ear, right? And just see what you think about this. Because I don't know if I totally understand it completely. Well, I know I don't understand it completely, but with talking with Johannes about his teacher, wrote a book called The Weirdness of Being. And it's a very difficult book. I mean, uh, Giannaro, I think is his name. He's Italian, and he was Johannes's teacher.
Gennaro? Yeah,
Gennaro.
that sounds right. Yeah.
I really like that guy. I
Very, very
mean,
Italian.
he's intensely what I imagine Heidegger to be like, right? In terms of thinking, like the practice of and the rigor of the thought and the thinking, but really fluid at the same time. But anyways, he's talking about that this book is really central, like as far as I can tell, is really central around him trying to reveal a fundamental uh, a misapprehension of what Heidegger was talking about. And what he was saying is that, like, the notion of what gets translated as possibility, right, um, in Heidegger, right? And possibility, you could say, is like Heidegger's thing was, if we say Hegel was all about actuality, right? And Heidegger was like, no, a big thing about it is like, no, it's like what trumps actuality and what even calls it into being actual is the possibility or the future or that sense of things, right?
Mm.
But reading this book, he's really showing how when Heidegger says whatever word he says in German that gets translated in possibility is taken really from the Roman sense of possibility, which means to kind of take or to grab hold of something. It has kind of more of a dominant, like going after something, like realizing your possibilities, right? Something you can grab. But where Heidegger was taking it, it was really like a mistranslation on a very deep level, because he said that actually it comes from a root of something that means to like. It means like, and specific, like to like or to love, and that actually the sense of being or the sense of possibility, right? It's more like it likes you,
Mm.
right? It that's our kind of phenomenological experience, is that we, in a certain sense, being or possibility or that dimension of being, right, as a phenomena, is in a certain sense a liking Dasein, right, or being there. And I was like, wow, like when I started to get that, there's something in me went of just to think about that, of like that. No, we don't, like, even with dialogos, it's not like we know about a possibility, right, that we then move towards because we think it's possible. It's more like I more got the sense of like the possibility actually is moved by us.
Mm.
And in a certain sense, it reaches toward us, right? And that's how we actually end up in this relationship with it, right?
Right.
And I was just thinking about that with like dialogos of, and that is my experience with like ultimately what I end up moving towards. There is a sense of just um there's something about whatever it is that I don't quite understand, but that some possibility is keeps getting hold of me. Right?
So it's like as we mean toward the world, it tends to
Mhm,
mean back toward us.
mhm,
I think it's kind of catches traction a little bit with
mhm.
some of the features of Heidegger that ally him with pragmatism.
Yeah,
I think in some ways, right?
yeah,
That it catches that transjective relationship
yeah.
with the revelation of the world that becomes so
Right,
affected in
right,
dialogos.
right. And that it's like it's reaching towards us. There's something about that reversal, or like it reversed the sense in which I was thinking about it. And so when I kind of got it, all of a sudden I was like, oh, it's really about, on a different level. It's like really the position of love and the primacy of love, right?
Yes. It's the difference between encountering
Yeah,
and being encountered.
yeah,
It
yeah,
seems to happen in this practice that we're talking about. It
yes,
seems to happen that we find ourselves encountered. And in being so encountered, we're also disclosed in the encounter,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because we're conferring our egoic identity
yeah,
onto or into a dynamic that's transpersonal.
right,
I think we experience ourselves as being encountered by the dynamic with which we now identify. Because we now identify with this dynamic symbolically, we can be so encountered in a
yeah,
way that seems not of our person
right,
precisely,
right.
right? That is both intimate and yet
Yeah,
not personal to the contents of ego in the way that we usually think about it.
right. I guess that's what, I guess that's why my understanding of like the original notion of education that goes back into Greece, like the first announcements of that, had less to do with less to do with, like, now we usually think about being educated as like, the student is a little vessel and you just fill it up with stuff, right? But
Yeah.
like the original sense of it was more like, to be educated is to be seized, right? Be seized by something, right? To be
Hmm.
like possessed in some way, or, and it was a complete, like, as you say, you cannot know without being known, and you cannot be known by being, without being changed by being known, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
no
yeah,
more that sense
yeah.
of intimacy, right? Of the,
That's right. That's right. And then I think then in dialogos and philosophia, you're being made a character of knowing,
hmm
right? It's like being made a character in a narrative.
yeah,
Suddenly, your hand is guided by the narrative. It's not guided by your agency per se, right? You partake of the very thing of which you're now possessed. And there's a reciprocity to it. So it might be deterministic, and yet, but its determinism involves a kind of sacramental submission
yeah,
to
right,
its making of you,
right. Yeah,
right? It's as though you surrender yourself to be made.
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Breathe
yeah,
it, and you breathe it. It breathes us. Yeah, it's
that's
interesting.
right. That's right. And then, of course, the midwifery metaphor comes back into play with
Yeah.
that, I think, too. Yeah,
Well, yeah, where thought becomes, you both become conceived, right? Conception, conceive,
yeah, yeah.
right?
And then that's also that
The midwifery.
intimates the role of love too, as you say,
Yeah,
right? You have to,
yeah,
that you're in that being enfolded into it is being enfolded into relation. And the way
yeah,
we characterize that relation is as a relation of love, right?
right.
The poetic form of love.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's,
yeah, yeah.
and of course, education per se has been pretty dispossessed of love
Yeah.
as part of its
Oh, yeah,
its mo.
totally.
But that was, yeah, that's, I think it's central, and that's what I think, it's what dialogos reintroduces, precisely, really what dialogos reintroduces,
Yeah,
which is why beginning interpersonally is so essential, right?
yeah,
Because you have to spark there has to be an emergence of love before that love can then be transmuted and
right.
become and then become the symbolizing vessel that then recreates the relationship
Yeah,
and evolves it into something anagogic in the way
right,
that we know dialogos combines the
right, right.
right that the horizontality of the interpersonal and the verticality of the ontological. It's love,
Yeah,
trite as that may sound. It's love that love is the point of convergence, which is also the point of emergence
yeah,
of that dynamic, right?
right.
I
Because
think.
there's the agape,
That's precisely it.
right? There's the agape.
Yeah.
That's I really like the way that John puts that, of like, it it births people, a person, right? And
Hmm.
being so deeply seeing them, like,
Hmm.
births them in a sense.
That's right.
But then it's like that's part of it. But then it goes into, is it, what's the one that naturally goes into it? Is it philia?
Yeah, well, because it's interesting because philia is the like the contexture of
Mhm.
dialogue is
Yeah,
philia, right? Philia is its sort of default context,
yeah,
right? That's and philia seems to be instrumental in alchemizing the wandering eros
right,
into the poesis of agape. But then there's a reciprocity that seems to happen even with the agape once conduced, because with the agape, because it's almost as though, the people gather, if we were to return momentarily to our campfire metaphor, right? The people gather around the fire, and then they actually, in the it's like formally, the formation of their particular concert is the philia, but their attraction to it, their attraction to one another and through one another, is the eros that they've come prepared with, the always already eros that puts them into relation with being, even before they are in the formal relation of philia. And what the formal relation of philia does is it midwifes agape from the interpenetrating eros within the dialogos. But then the emergent entity, what we've called sort of the third factor, or John and I call it the Geist in the chapter we wrote about it, is that the Geist then becomes the kind of intermediary between what we're calling suchness and moreness, right? It is precisely the dialectical spirit that mediates the relation between the open water of the inexhaustible and the particular stricture of the suchness of that particular encounter.
Yes.
And then the Geist, as that daimonic hermetic intermediary, is then midwives us back through the dynamic. So it's like we are created by the very thing that our cultivated eros creates before us, right?
Yeah.
And so then there's a dialectic reciprocity in the poiesis of the dialogue itself. It's not just a reciprocity between the dialogists, the participants, but it's a reciprocity between each individual and the entity that emerges through the reciprocity. It's sort of, so it's like an anagogic reciprocity. It's a reciprocity that evolves from interpersonal reciprocity to a reciprocity with the open-endedness of being.
Right. Totally.
And so that opening reciprocity, I guess the reciprocal opening would be appropriate enough, right? Mark Lewis's term, or John's riff on Mark Lewis's term. Then becomes a way of understanding the anagogic dynamic of dialogos, right? Because you start with one kind of reciprocal opening, and it actually tilts and unfolds into an ontology of reciprocity.
Right.
So being in relation with others tutors your being in relation with being.
Yeah, totally. So in some way, right? So the practice of dialogos, right? Like why practice it? Why practice Socratic Platonic dialogue, right? Is this sense of internalizing something, right? Where, and I think you've said this before, and this is a little bit what you've been writing about too. I think you and John have been writing together, is about this sense of the internal dialogos, that it's there's dialogos that can be embodied in a relationship or in a group of people, but then there's the dialogos or dialogic can be in your perception of a tree, like with a dream, that that it can catch and become internalized and be the way in which you reach out to the world and the world reach out to you, that can be infused.
That's right. Exactly. And I think that has to do with the way the suchness of a particular, whether we might call it a particular perceptor, a particular entity of being, the way its suchness becomes possessed of more. There's a metaphor that and I've taken to thinking, certainly is not an original idea, this motif has been around for a long time, but I've taken to thinking about it as the relation between sound and silence. I think I've mentioned that maybe once or twice before. But I was thinking about that, and then I came across a passage of William James, in his Principles of Psychology, I think. And he uses a very similar metaphor, pragmatically, of a thunderclap and the relationship that the thunderclap has with the backdrop of silence into which it dissolves, right? And the idea that you cannot know the thunderclap independent from the backdrop. This is obviously verging into Heidegger, and there's a reason why those two particular modes of thinking are so affined, right? But that the thunderclap cannot be known independently from the silence into which it sinks and against which it is known and heard and resonates. And so that to me is precisely a way of metaphorically capturing the dialectical relationship between the embodied suchness and its capacity to mean itself more, to mean itself more. The thunderclap can somehow mean itself more by becoming more enveloping of the very silence that encloses it.
Yeah.
And that perforates it. So the dialectical relation between such and more is something that is symbolized in the dialectical relation with thou, right? Because thou is a combinative being that consists of both such and more when known as thou, when known in possibility, right? And so then that's I think one of the reasons why dialogos becomes such a it becomes a culture, it becomes a way of enculturing. I almost think of it like a little petri dish, like a bacterial culture of sorts, even though that's not a very flattering image. But it's like it's a way of culturing that very dialectical ontology, but culturing it in a way that it can be psychologically symbolized and made available to us imminently. And I think that is its great function, its availableness, its readiness to hand, I suppose, if I was to say it in a Heideggerian way, is precisely what avails its potential for us, I think, at this particular moment in time.
Right. Since thinking about, like, I wonder if this is kind of what, since it's kind of an interesting thing to do as a practice, right? Because probably what it takes to actually do it is very much speaking to what you're talking about. Sometimes I'll go for a walk, or I'll be around some people or something like that, and I'll just I'll look at somebody and I'll just see if I can find the place, right, where I could actually conceive of spending the rest of eternity with them. Right? Like, not that it's a good idea, not that I would or something, but like that I can it's like that sense of like I could bide and spend the rest of my life with them. Like that feeling into that place. And it's interesting. Most of the time I can't. And it's hard to describe, but I think that's a little bit of what we're getting at, right?
I think I think I know what you mean. I think that's a profound analogy. That's really good. That's really good. Profound, precisely because it's just available enough to imagine, and yet supremely difficult at the same time.
Right. Because there's a feedback, right? There's a feedback thing about like, it's something about like whatever it is that could, whatever it's reaching for seems to be something like that, right? The place where even if, right?
Yes. No, the gesture of its meaning, that particular analogy is a deep gesture. Yeah. It's a deep gesture. It gestures beyond its conceivable application. It gestures beyond its conceivable actuality, which is precisely what makes it dialectical.
Right. And there is a sense of like where it's like, there's something in the eye or in the face. It's like where it's like something about like, okay, right there. Okay. And you can feel, I almost feel, you could feel it's like a visceral, okay, I could abide there, right there. Uh-huh.
That's right. And it takes a particular moment of beauty to advert your attention to that particular possibility too, right? Do you ever have that experience? You're talking to somebody and just nothing is happening. And then there's one comment or one particular, you suddenly the aperture of being opens ever so slightly as to allow a little bit of light through, and you suddenly see possibility in relation to a person that was not available a moment before, right? The cosmos protrudes through them, as it were, right? and then cultivating that's that glimmer of beauty, however momentary it might be, is precisely the affordance of turning on the heel of the relationship and tipping it into something properly dialogic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's so interesting too, the experience of not finding that with somebody.
Yeah.
Like where it's like and that's really true. It's like sometimes there are just people that, or a relationship that it gets lost, or that where there isn't that something that catches. And it's, for me anyways, it's the experience of like, I don't know if it's the opposite of it, but it's something else, right?
How do the proportions work out for you? Because you've made a vocation out of pronouncing this potential in people and eliciting it and worming it, and creating the conditions for it, right? You have that cultivated as a craft.
Right.
I find it very rare.
Mm-hmm.
I find realizing that possibility, let's assume that it always remains possible, but I find my realization of that possibility quite rare in people, in relationships with people. Right. And to the point where I find that the number where that possibility is realized is far fewer than the volume of people, or the volume of, shouldn't put it in terms of persons, but put it in terms of relations, or in terms of encounters. That seems better. But the number of relationships that don't seem to draw out those conditions are far greater in number and volume for me than the ones that do. But you have an affinity with this as a practice. How do you find that shakes out in your experience?
You mean the part where when it doesn't go like that?
Yeah, how often does that happen? And then what kind of effort do you put in any given encounter? Not, when you're at the store and like buying milk or something, but in anything more substantial than the most, I don't know, than the most quotidian of experiences. How much do you put? No, that's not the right question. There's the logos of the right question, and I haven't gotten there yet. What's the right question? The right question is, what is the value for you in finding that reliably in any given encounter beyond the most superficial of encounters?
Right. Well, like we were talking about before, it's been something to kind of like, when you have a vocation like this, right? And you show up for a course and you start relating to people and you don't feel like it. You're not in the mood or something like that.
Yeah, we were talking about that.
Resistance to doing it, right?
Yeah.
And so I've been in situations where, but you just don't really have the conditions of my life that I have committed to don't justify me going with that feeling. There's another thing that is calling for me, which is really great. I mean, that's why we have commitments, right? Like it's precisely, we're committed precisely because those times that we don't feel like doing it. Right.
We defer agency to the commitment itself, right?
But there's a greater sense of it's just simply better, right? If that happens. Now, I don't always feel like, if I'm not in a course or something like that and I'm in a bad mood or something like I'm not necessarily predisposed and looking for that, right? But I have to say that, like, if I have a choice between being that way and not being that way is just better, right? It's always enriched. It's always more enriched. And I think there are people that call it out naturally for me, right? But you're right. The thing about there is something about the ritual of doing it over and over and over and over and over again, right? Like opening that way with somebody, inviting them to open that way too. And it's also kind of like, it's got to be he's funny. There is a naturalness for it with me too. Like it's strange for me to say this because I'm like, I set conditions up for this to happen, but like, at least for me in my own life, there is a quality of like, I really want it to be a natural inclination, right? That happens. Like, it's almost the opposite of like when if I take a position like I'm going to do something to somebody or I'm going to make something happen or something like that, it's contextually, I think with manipulation, like you can't manipulate it, right? Or if you come from manipulating it, you're sitting in the wrong place for it to happen, right? So, but like if I'm, for example, I mean, I was doing this like I was having a couple of like hard days earlier this week, and I noticed there's that self-enclosure that kind of starts to happen. And I went outside and I walked around and I just was like, let's see if I can find that place in people, right? And I could. And there was something about like, I didn't talk to anybody, but I was just, because we don't talk to anybody anymore now anyways, it's illegal, but like having that place and finding that spot there's an openness to that, right? Yeah, but I'm definitely not enlightened.
Well, that's that's a tall order against which to measure yourself.
Right.
But I mean, you have obviously, that much is obvious. You have a particular predisposition for it, right? You have a knack for it, a cultivated knack, but a knack nevertheless. But to me, the thing I find discourages me from it as a matter of course. Sometimes we were talking also about this a little bit before, about how solitude begets solitude, and how sometimes your need for aloneness becomes well, it can become addictive, although I actually don't mean it as an addiction, but I mean it as a particular mode of appetite. Maybe that is an addiction. Maybe it is, but the thing that I find difficult is that the energy required to fall into that, well, no, that's not quite right. Falling into it is precisely what doesn't require the energy, or what seeds the energy as opposed to depletes it. But it's not until the moment, if I can maybe put this with a Heideggerian spin, until the moment when it becomes the always already condition of your being, until the moment that you wake within it and find it acting through you as a property of your sudden world.
Right.
Until the moment that happens, it is unavailable.
Right.
I find, right? Until the moment that happens, it is unavailable.
Yeah, totally.
And the prospect of mustering the resources to conjure it or to somehow induce it willfully, I find to be a prospect that is so distant as to be almost hopeless, right? The idea that I can muster the wherewithal necessary to engage people in rapt conversation or in dialogues, for God, God forbid. And yet, when suddenly you're I'm in the throes of the process, when suddenly the world consists of the process as one of its properties, suddenly the energy required is implicit to the being of that world. And is no longer unavailable. It's extant at that point. But there's this gap. It's a gap of ontology. maybe it's also a bit of an epistemic gap. I'm not exactly sure how best to philosophically characterize that gap, but there is a gap between the world in which that is unavailable and seems fruitless, you know,
Yeah.
and the world in which it's so abundant as to be inexhaustible.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and bridging from one to the other is precisely, I think, what requires the symbolon, right? It requires a symbolic.
Right.
That's precisely what the dialogic praxis as a symbol does. Is it bridges from one world into the other. But without that symbol available, without that symbolizing vessel, I find it remarkably, remarkably difficult. It's that chasm can seem pretty insuperable, or I guess that's a wrong metaphor, but it can seem impossible to cross.
Yeah. It's like, well, it's like that's, I think you're right though. Here's the thing if I look at it like where I think I just was kind of looking or trying to work it out, like in terms of like my own subjectivity, right? My own subjectivity within the walls of my own skin. I fucking like, like it doesn't take much for me not to feel like doing something good, right? Like,
Yeah.
but I think if I look at myself as distributed into the world, right? This is where it's really important to really be committed, make commitments, binding commitments that call forth from you somebody who's beyond your preferences, your day-to-day. Because I think that's how I can take almost any human being, right? And you just have them go with their preferences. I think our preferences is just to be comfortable and to be
slovenly.
Like you just alone and just like go do what you feel like, and you'll end up high demanding, right? And just the but I think that there's a sense in which Guy is he's distributed in his life, right? So on one level it's like sometimes the feeling state, right, is inspired, right, and I would just move towards that if I wasn't committed to it, and in other times the feeling state is in the symbol of the activity or the commitment that's holding it, right? And I think that's the way it's supposed to be, right?
Hence marriage and our discussions about marriage. Your take on marriage was, if I recall, precisely that covenantal consignment of yourself to the very thing that is going to call forth what is most real and meaningful from you, even if it doesn't feel available in the moment.
Yep. And this is why, like, it's interesting. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about like this is gonna, the crisis with everybody working at home. Companies are finding out that you can operate without having to meet in an office. I think it's I mean, that may be a little bit of an early call.
Oh yeah, that's an early call.
My experience is that if it's precisely going into the office is what allows people to be as productive as they are. It's because of the institution and the structure. Is Brienne's home, and she's still like it just she notices it's like it's so easy for her to like the house calls her attention to all these different things, and it isn't work. Right? So it's really taking a new muscle for her to stay working, right?
No. And I'm glad you said that, because this has kind of been on my mind for the last couple of days. And it has to do with this virtual environment that is multiplying around us. And I mean I don't mean like I don't mean the global phenomenon of everyone using virtual tools, but I mean the particular dialogic arena that we're seeing around us. All of these other dialogoi, right? And all of the people that we're now that are increasingly becoming this community. And there are so many names for it now. I can't keep track of them. And a lot of the folks that you're talking with and that John's talking with, etc. And there's something genuinely exciting about it for all of the reasons that we've enumerated. But I have a concern about it too.
Mm-hmm.
And John and I have talked a little bit about this. I think I'm more concerned about it perhaps than he is, although I don't want to speak for him in that respect. But this capacity that we're inducing right now by talking, I want to underwrite it with as much enthusiasm as possible, because I have been so surprised by how authentic it has felt, and how authentic its moding has been to me, and to me, right? I mean, I wouldn't know you or be talking to you if this weren't the case. I'm incredibly humbled and grateful for it.
Right.
So now, all of that said, I am worried about the possibility that the virtuality starts, that the virtual medium becomes confused as a necessary design feature of dialogos itself. Because I don't subscribe to that in a million years, not in my life. I will always prefer the embodied physical presence of the thou with whom I am ritualizing. Without a doubt, for me, the preference is still clear and completely unambiguous. And I know that there are features of virtual, this, like, you know, I think John, even in our last conversation with John and Jordan, John was talking about the fact that, you know, your face appears bigger on a screen, and that would have implications for personal space were two people to be in the same room together. And I think that's a good observation, and I think that there is something to that. There is something to the format that grants a certain shared spatial presence that perhaps is hard to come by, at least until you get to know somebody very well. But for me, there is no substitution here. And it would take, I don't know what kind of persuasive argument it would take to convince me that the virtuality of this medium is somehow more conducive to dialogos than the physical presence of people in the same room, because I will always prefer that. And I don't think we're even close to being able to make the claim that the virtuality is a worthy substitute or a worthy successor to the physical embodied presence of persons sharing space and dialogue. And I'm a little concerned that all of the extolling of the virtual medium that's happening, and it's very well deserved, but I'm worried that extolling of the virtual medium will start to enculturate the idea that somehow this virtuality is necessary for dialogos to flourish.
Oh God, no.
And I really, and maybe it's so obvious that it doesn't even need to be said, but somehow I have this concern that it's a shiny new toy and we're all in love with it right now. And I know why, and fair enough, but it's not a shiny new toy that should be confused with some kind of necessary condition for a practice that's been, you know, totally long lived without it.
Totally.
Anyway, sorry, that was a bit of a spiel, but I'm something about what you said really tapped that apprehension of mine, and I'm wondering what you think of it.
Well, one thing I had this thought as you're talking about is like, I don't know if it's obvious or not, but I don't think it's a substitute. I'm just like, but but the danger isn't that we would think that it is. The danger is that the drift, right? There's a drift, right, where we could just find ourselves at some point within these constraints and thinking inside of them. And that's the thing I think you probably have your eye on.
That's a very Heideggerian critique, which is good.
Yes, totally.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Exactly. Propositionally, I think most people would agree that it's not a substitution, but I'm worried about I'm worried about it tacitly becoming so.
Right. Now, if we look at it like, what is it about, let's explore this kind of sense, the sensibility that you find yourself having, right? About this isn't like the virtual thing without sharing space. It's just, it's not the same thing, right? And you can't equate it as the same thing. It's not going to be a substitute, right? What is it that you understand about that? That like, what is it about sharing space versus just seeing each other's space yet only sharing time?
Mm.
Like, what is it about about like if we say it's not just, there is a kind of obviousness to it, but that's what actually has me start to think about it. Like, what is it that's obvious about that, right?
That's a good question.
What happens when we share space together or in a space together, um, versus not, versus
For me, what comes to mind is the ritual of it.
Mhm.
That there is a certain there is a necessity of embodiment when it comes to um, to imagining and also executing ritual.
Mhm.
That the physicality, right,
Yeah,
the flesh of it,
yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe this is the Catholic in me. It could very well be, I guess, but it wouldn't make it unimportant though. There is something, to me at least, there's something very necessary about the flesh of the process. It
mhm,
must be fleshed.
yeah,
It must be fleshed, and
right.
I think it must be consummated in the flesh, and the, yeah, this is definitely the Catholic in me. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, I think that's it. Is that the word must be made
Yeah,
flesh in the dialogos.
right.
I can't believe I just said that, but and I cannot. I don't see a way around that. I
Right.
don't. And that's not that. I mean, again, like, that doesn't devalue this, but
Mhm.
this to me, part of the value of the virtuality is its value. It's part of its value is its referring, right? To me, the value that's realized in the virtual dialogos refers us to the value of the ritual embodied dialogos, right?
Right.
There is continuity between the phenomena, between the practices. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
If anything, I think that the virtuality of this process valorizes its embodiment and further encourages it.
Right. Right.
Um, so there's yes, the capacity, the symbolic capacity for ritualization, I think, predicates in embodiment,
Yeah.
and I don't see that.
Mm. Yeah.
I can't see myself outside of that. Maybe some people can, but I can't.
Yeah.
So there's that, and then with that comes all of the. I mean, as we all well know, there's a wealth of intimation that
Mm.
happens in the margins of the propositional and semantic content that is precisely
Yeah.
a product of gesture,
Yeah.
and we can convey a certain amount of that in video conferencing, in video dialogue. We can a little bit, and that's not insignificant, but it's not. I also don't think it's sufficient. It's certainly nowhere near comprehensive. And
Yeah.
so if dialogue, let's put it this way, if the dialogos is if dialogos is the ritualized meaning towards,
Mhm.
and therein aspires to be anagogic,
Mhm.
then we want to mark it with the deepest, most complex gestures that it is capable of intimating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in order to do that sufficiently, we also have to embody it.
Right. Right.
as comprehensively. We have to embody the process of contemplation as comprehensively and comprehensively as we can possibly afford ourselves.
Yeah, 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 totally. Because there's so something about like, so for the word to become flesh, right? I
Yeah.
love that.
And
I
when I
love,
said I can't believe I just said that, I didn't mean that in a kind of, I didn't
yeah,
mean that in a sacrilegious way. I said I can't believe I said that because I can't believe I'm using it so. I don't mean to use something like that so casually,
mhm,
because I know what that invokes.
mhm,
It invokes an ocean that I can't hope to swallow. But so I said I can't believe I said that, not because
yeah,
anyway, I'm
yeah,
equivocating here. Why am I equivocating? Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm aware of all that I'm invoking by saying that,
yeah,
and I know that I'm being crushed by the very invocation, even
mhm,
as I invoke it, but I
right.
still invoke it purposefully. Yeah.
Yes, yes. There's something about like, because I'm just thinking about this sense of what it is to be in a space with another person, right? Like, because there's, the difference between Brienne being home and not being home. So right now, from what you can see, like nothing, right? It's like it doesn't none of that shows. But her
Although I
being
did see her walk by, so it shows a little.
totally, totally,
I
her
know what you mean.
being there, right? Like on some level, her presence, right, is 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 enacted through me and in ways that my nervous system is oriented around, right? So so if we think about that, like because so much of the dialogos, right, um, its impact has this quality of being with people that is at the level of how like a child knows how to speak. There's a mimicry, right? Of like when somebody's being really, really present or is moved by something and they're embodying something, right? Their uh their silence gathers so many different dimensions, right? There's a tuning up of that you can't put into words, right? And you can't explain. And I think that is we all inhabit that in a conversation, right? Like so there's that inhabitation, right? That that I just think that there's an orientating thing that when your body like feels into the space and it's oriented around, right? There's so many things that I'm like abiding by that I could do that I'm not doing right now. Well, how do I know not to do that? It's because there's a way that I'm in social space. My body is knows to gesture in certain ways, right? Like I don't I don't go and like shoot. I don't take the hot dog, although it would be nice to stick it in my ear because it feels good. I just don't do it. And that not doesn't isn't because it's not possible. It's very
Mhm.
possible. But like that not these ranges that I'm inside of are so embodied social organizations that aren't
Yes.
thought about, right?
Yeah.
But like I think when you're in a conversation, that's what's great about like conversing is that because there is a little place where you're kind of creating a universe, right? In which you know you get haunted with new knots, right? Orientations, new knots that you don't go into, right? And on a very visceral level, and it does seem like that's a 3D experience, right? It's a 3D experience. Whereas with, but I also think it, but it's also, I think your protest around this, right? Or your warning, I should say, around it also is begetting of something even more than that, right? That it's possible to have to drift that way, right? That it's possible that it could just go that way. In fact, it's more likely, actually, if you just look at the movement of things, it's more likely that it will,
You're
right?
right. Yeah.
And I think that there's another part of embodied experience is that, and it's precisely what technology um, gets rid of, right? In fact, the more it collapses distance, right, the more concealed the being of something is, right? Like it's weird. It's like the closer something is, the more it doesn't exist, right? So it's like so it's the difference between sending a text and then a letter, reading a letter.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a completely different thing going on there, because you have to actually endure the character of the paper, of my handwriting. You got to go through the struggle, right?
Right.
So in some ways, on some level, the letter isn't instant, right? You have to go through more of a process and endure
Mm-hmm.
something, which you could tell if you got a letter versus just like a text. That thing would stand out. It'd be present to you. Like you'd remember it. It would sit someplace in you, right? Versus if you just read that. So there's a quality of, like, I think everywhere in our world, in ways that are so fucking I think it's so hard to fathom to what degree, because we think within it, right? We don't think about it much, right? It's hard to get outside of it, but the amount of distance in just a short period of time that's been collapsed, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we don't no longer notice that we don't experience anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's precisely the stuff, right? It's through struggle, which is where character arises from.
Mm-hmm. That's
So,
right. That's
so
right. The removal of resistance is a
yeah,
serious philosophical problem.
yeah.
Yeah.
So like that kind of thing about like going through something, having somebody challenge you and feeling like not being able to escape it and like having to confront it, and then like all
Yes.
right.
Yes. Yes. That's interesting. That's interesting. Yeah. That immediacy of everything.
Yeah.
And even in these particular, even in these forums, and even in the virtual discourses that we're talking about, some of that immediacy daunts me a little bit, because and I think it's part of why I'm leery of becoming overcommitted to a sphere of discourse that demands immediate attention, ceaseless immediate attention. To
Yes.
me, I see that as a very, very risky thing of which to partake. And there's a joy in the partaking of it, but there's also, to me, a real danger, because there's an edifying and upbuilding dimension of the being whisked away by it, of the being whisked away by something of such complexity. But there's also a danger in the being whisked away by it,
Yeah.
because it becomes very difficult to then recollect and retrieve and regather
Yeah.
the dispersions of yourself that can then be cast across the space, because it is now so because it is now so sort of ubiquitous and instantaneous both. To me, the possibility of being lost within it
Right.
is also commensurably greater.
Right. Right.
Yeah, yeah. So that that and it seems to be just a property of the environment now, that
Mhm.
as everything becomes more and more entangled, as everything, the encounters and meetings and the discourses and the conversations, as everything now starts weaving together, and it's complexifying so rapidly, there's great sapiential potential in that complexification. But there is also a certain breathlessness to it. There's almost a certain anaerobic sprint
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
it encourages.
Yeah.
And I find myself very leery of that.
Right. Yeah, if there's a sprint without having to endure the exhaustion afterwards,
That's
like
right.
in any like direct way. Like if you like a sprint, it's interesting. When you sprint, when you're done, you know you just went through something.
Yeah.
There's something about sprinting in this way that it disappears right away. At most, you get a sense of like, yeah, I've been sitting too long, or like I haven't noticed my body, which is like that's one of the dangers I've noticed about being in front of the screen
Yeah.
so much, is that there's so much of this feedback loop that like you lose touch with your body, so you don't feel how uncomfortable you actually are.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a quality of like the amount of things that we're covering without having, yeah, it's interesting. It's really true.
Because
I
there's something about what I mean. This I guess this is almost kind of an Augustinian thought, something like that. But that when something is when the ontology of something is distributed temporally, there is something about being that is revealed when distributed
mm,
across time, right?
yeah,
So that anything that I think, in some
yeah,
sense, anything that that appreciates across time, that is reflective of its particular ontology, as opposed to something that depreciates across time. If the distance of time has an impact on the normativity of something, that's telling. And so there's something about, I mean, there's something about, I mean, and I guess that just gets into Hans' arguments about time a little bit too, but there's something, what am I trying to say?
mm,
That that time is a way of it is a when I guess when we get into a certain relationship with it, it can be a way of measuring out the particular normativity
mm,
of certain acts,
yeah,
certain speeches, certain exercises. It is revealing of normativity, if not constituting of it, but at least revealing of it, right? And that's why that's why I think there's all this discourse about being in the right relationship to time or wrong relationship to time, because time becomes a kind of a way of distributing out the being of a particular entity such that its being becomes perceptually measurable or appreciable,
mm,
and so it becomes a way of knowing the nature of the activities that we're
mm,
undertaking, right?
right,
The time it takes to do them
yeah,
embodies the particular nature of the thing that is taking the time.
yeah, yeah,
And absent that, I think it's very hard to be properly appreciative, right,
mm,
in both senses of the term,
mm,
of what is happening when it takes so little time.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry, that was a garbled mess, but there's something I don't quite have that clear
Well,
yet. But
like that, it's not immediately right there. It tells us like I think that we're onto something, like what we're kind of feeling into here, right? Because there's also that there's this, it is part of the whole thing. I think that bleeds through that, like when we end, we press a button, it's gone. You can't do that like in physical proximity, right? Like in fact, it's not just the isolated thing about like instant on off, right? It's the possibility that's being that of that being the case that actually is present through the whole thing.
that's
And
right.
so when I think about this sense with like basically in physical space, right? There's a sense of coming off the horizon and coming
Mm-hmm.
close, right? And then meeting, and there's that whole thing that like orientation, like sizing things up, and
The narrativity of it, the proper narrativity of it, the
exactly,
before, the during, the after.
yeah, right, and enduring that and feeling
Yeah,
body orienting around that, and the different customs, and like I'm different outside than I am inside.
That's
And
right.
there's transition moments. And that somehow, in some way, that's got to be present. Like if you and I sat together, like we went through that and we had this exact conversation, except for on the couch, right? That beginning walking in and it being a process that we mutually disclose is disclosed with us. That is the, yeah, with this, it's very easy for it to be,
Yeah, contained.
It's gone. It's gone.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
It's gone.
That's right. That's right. It's right. We can contain it, and we can multiply it much more easily. Whereas if I come to your house and I sit on your couch, the time taken and the space taken, as the conversation unfolds, there's an assonance between the journey taken in the conversation and the spatial and temporal journey undertaken in the series of movements required to get us into the situation of the conversation. So the enworlding, the conversance, as you say, right? The conversance, the co-creation of the particular cosmos of the conversation is something that, when spanning distance and spanning space and time, it symbolizes, I think, more, it symbolizes it's a more enacted experience, precisely because the process is concurrent at those different levels of intelligibility. It's right, the different scales of the different scales of logos in the dialogos are synchronizing, right? They're synchronizing, right? It's, I mean, right, the same reason why people go for a walk with somebody to while they're having a discussion, right? Let's take a walk and discuss. It's because the actual journey of the walk is analogically assonating with the contents of the conversation as they're unfolding. You're trying to symbolically pair. You're trying to live out the metaphoricity so as to conduce the very process that will realize its no, that's not quite right. You're trying to realize your conversation at a somatic level, at a level of physicality that matches to the intelligibility of the speech itself, right? You're trying to get those things to connect. I mean, that's what's happening. Part of what's happening in ritual, right, is that you're trying to conform your gesture to the logos of your speech, as to possess it with as much intelligible latitude as possible, as to accommodate as much mystery as it can possibly fathom. And there's a way in which these contained spurts of conversation, though they're so deeply meaningful in the course of their occurrence, they can be so easily extracted from that somatized analogic process that usually contains them, and that means you can also do many of them, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I don't actually like to, I mean, this is very meaningful. I find this very meaningful, but I don't like to do it. I don't want to do this every day. I don't even want to do this every week necessarily. Because for me, which is why sometimes, which is part of the leeriness that I'm describing, the leeriness of participation, even in an arena as fruitful and as well-meaning. I mean that. I mean that very pregnantly, given our discussions about meaning. Even an arena of conversation as well-meaning as the one that's happening right now, I'm leery of over-participation, because for me, the before, the during, and the after is a necessary and indispensable part of those conversations. And if I do one of these every day, there's no way there's no way that I can spatialize it adequately as to appreciate its meaning.
Yeah.
And I don't want to hyperventilate my way through these. I want to breathe them with deep lungfuls before, during, and after. I want to make proper narratives out of them and live them in such a way that the living of them partakes of the same intelligible pattern as the logos that is spoken within them. And I find that personally impossible to do.
Yeah.
If, and maybe for some people it is possible. I don't preclude that possibility, but I find myself very limited in my capacity to appreciate them if they become so regularized, if they become these daily, anyway, I've gone on. But
Yes.
yeah, that's.
Now, what would you say? Actually, now if we just take this out, like, let's just say that you did do it every day, except for you did it at a place, right, in a room or a temple, right, and you engaged in dialogos every day, or like on a walk, right, or something like every day, versus doing it like this. It's just interesting. I doubt that you would still prefer to do it every day. If it was, maybe you would, but if we chain that out, what would be the difference?
Mm,
Is it like, what would be the difference, right?
that's a good question. That's a good question.
Well, what I have a feeling, my first thing that comes to mind is I have a feeling that, like, if we were meeting every day, and we were walking around the lake, right? That there's something about a walk or being together every day where that thing about, yeah, it's funny, it's the allowance of silence would make space for, like, you being in a mood or something, or not, or being withdrawn, right? Like, where it's like you could be withdrawn or in a mood or not really kind of there, but yet that, whereas online it just wouldn't make any sense to not talk, right?
That's right.
Space, like, because unless
Yes.
you're talking,
Oh, I
that's
like that.
the thing, right? But we're sharing something together, that even your silence is a disclosure, right, to us, that we may or may not pay attention to. We may poke you and tease you about it. But we, like, or we may just let you be, right? But it would be a communique. It would be
Yes.
part of the conversation in some way, right?
Right.
And you would still partake of it, and you could partake of it, right? Because it would fill out in that space. And so just that alone, it's like, if you could do that and have that, right? Like, first of all, it'd be a real different thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I hadn't put my finger on that, but now that you've said it that way, I think you've pinned something really important, which is that when this practice is distributed over space and perhaps also over time, it allows for it's much more accommodative for non-verbal intimations, for the non-verbal meaning, for the silence to interfuse the sound, for the non-verbal meaning to punctuate between the syllables of the verbal meanings. And so by allowing conversation to breathe so much more, you allow it to accommodate, I think, more intelligibility. And that, you're right, that's something that's much, much more available when it takes place in a place.
Right.
Yeah. And it's also more disruptive. It's more disruptive. there's really not much that's disruptive. I mean, there's time allotment, but other than that, there's nothing disruptive about sitting down at the table, opening the computer, putting on a set of headphones, and
Yeah.
talking to you.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I close my laptop, I'm going to be back in my apartment, right? Now alone, suddenly, now no longer with Guy here, right? In a manner of speaking. Of course,
Yeah.
Guy's still here, but right, I'm no longer talking to Guy.
Yeah.
I'm back here alone in my apartment suddenly. And there's something about the suddenness of that
Yeah.
is, I find, especially if the dialogos itself, as it invariably is meaningful and joyful in its way, there's something about the abruptness of its end that is jarring to me every single time.
Right.
Every single time.
Right. So like
every single time I find it like, whoa, it's over. And what do I do with myself now? I feel like I need a, you know, it's like going and exercising and not doing a cool down or something like that, right? Like
yeah.
suddenly, so it's not, yeah, it's not, somehow the borders of the experience are not ceremonialized.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? The
Totally.
experience is meaningful,
Yeah.
but its borders are not ceremonialized.
Right.
And therefore, integrating it back into the rhythms of the everyday is correspondingly more difficult. It's like what John talks about with meditation, right? That the key is to actually, as you resurface from your meditation, to try and carry forth and then confer into the waking life all that you have contemplated, the very practice, the very dynamic of the practice that you've cultivated, to confer it into your waking life. But there's a way in which you can do that by spatializing the transition from one state into another. And there's something about just closing the computer,
Right.
for me, that does not do that. It
Yeah.
does not do that. It's much more abrupt.
Right. Right.
And that's not to say that there is no way to do that virtually. Maybe there is, maybe, but it's not obvious to me. And I think that's the point, is that it's not obvious that you can simply substitute for what the spatial distribution does to the ritual of your dialogue.
Yeah. Yeah. God, this is really like this is keying into so many things, right? Because I'm wondering about, I don't know if you've seen it, the few conversations I've had with Corey Anton. He wrote a book.
No, not yet. Corey
Yeah,
Anton.
Yeah, he wrote a book called Selfhood and Authenticity, where he basically takes, well, that was his first book. Then he wrote his second book on something significance in neo-stoicism, but he's got a continental philosophy base. He's a professor, great writer, and the last one he's did is called I think it's called the nothingness that haunts everything. He's great guy. Anyways, in that book, he talks about the other, right? He talks about the other as a condition of my own existence. And in other words, like there's not me in a world that is before I was born or after I was born. And you're not one of those things that I just encounter in space. Know that you're like already in you walking towards me. I am in some way haunted, right, with you as an eventing that I'm orienting to and being shaped by. And so many things are possible in that interaction that are so constituting that you aren't just a piece of stuff that I turn and look away like an object. You are a condition of my own existence. I am on some level called to justification in our enactment, right? And I'm wondering, like, as we're talking about this, I'm wondering if that actually happens online, like if that's really the case, in some way, like, because what is it to just, because so there's also this other thing about like when you eliminate, but you know, I want to another mark, or point to something here that's just interesting too. I think, and we ought to do one of these things without the visual and just do it with sound, like
Mm.
just auditory. I have a feeling that there's something about the visual, right, that is so binding, right? But
Oh
when
yeah.
it's just sound, right? Um, because there is a sense in which, like, yeah, there's something about that it just be interesting to experiment with, right? But like, what is it? What is it to be in the same room and like know that like if I got out of line, you could kill me, right? Like, what is?
That's
It's not like I
yeah.
think that. It's not like I'm considering that. But the truth of it is, if I exhibited a certain amount of behavior, right, like
Mhm.
I would elicit a response that would I'd have to contend with, right?
Yes.
And in that, it's because I haven't thought about it that much means it means how much of the normativity is granted by that possibility, right? Like,
Oh yeah. That's
right?
such a good point. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's right. No, you're exactly right. There are very primordial uh, stakes
right,
involved
right,
when suddenly we are
right.
in presentia with one another. There
Yeah,
are mortal stakes involved. This
totally.
absolute. We're primates still, right? There are suddenly all that is implicit in our social behavior
Yeah.
that exists. I remember. I think I was having a chat with Andrew Sweeney about this very thing, that this very distinction a while back. That suddenly, when you're present together in the same space, the confrontation is suffused with a certain modesty, and I
Mm,
mean modesty in more right in its wholer meaning, precisely because suddenly there is danger.
yeah.
Suddenly there's danger, and the
Yeah.
danger is important. And I think the danger in ritual is very important, right? That's why traditionally rituals involve,
Right.
to whatever degree, they involve a degree of danger,
Yeah.
um, however pronounced that happens to be. But I think that yes. Now, I guess one could say that there is a certain danger in the exposure of a virtual dialogue, and that's not nothing. And I
Yeah.
think that does serve an important function, right? The
Yeah.
presence of the onlookers does confer a certain amount of
Yeah.
implicit danger even to the virtual conversation. But
Totally.
there is an added dimension of
Mhm.
the danger of the physical confrontation
Mhm.
that always presents an implicit threat of injury
Mhm. Right.
that I think has something to do with the realness of the practice.
Mm.
Its capacity to access realness
Mm.
seems to me to have something to do with the imminent presence of danger.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And the more that presence of danger, and in some ways, maybe this is simply enumerating the conditions for flow. Maybe this shouldn't be surprising at all, right? Because the because challenge, right? Challenge that zone of proximal development, the challenge that elicits a response that
Yeah.
forces you to graduate your capacity in any given
Yeah.
moment is precisely one of the conditions for flow, right?
Yeah.
But when that is presented as a
Yeah.
as a very yeah when that's presented as a very immediate threat of danger, I think that has something to do with all of this.
Right. Right. Totally. And that sense of it's really kind of, and also in well, there is a certain amount of that in this, but it's the quality of like, and I think it really does matter if, if this was distributed in between moments in which we shared space embodied, right? Like, and not, I think that's a real big thing. If there's a future of that's, in fact, that's kind of what you're talking about, like, or like at least what I heard what you're talking about when you brought this up, that we could actually just have it be a tolerable thing, that some of the deepest conversations I have with people are online, and I don't even have an expectation of ever actually meeting them in person, right? Like, it's losing that horizon, right?
Mm.
That just becomes part of the world, which I think it will be. I think it is,
I
right?
think
In
it
a lot,
is. I
right?
think it is. Yeah.
It is a
Yeah.
lot of cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sense, but also that, just that sense of the edges. I've never really kind of thought about that, of like, yeah, it's the edges, but it's not just the stark beginning and end, but it's in what way are those edges substantiating through the very what I say, what I don't say, all those kinds of things, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, I think on some level, if reputation is on the line, right? Which, as long as you're speaking, pretty much it is, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, it's like pretty much it is. I mean, that I think grants it enough reality.
Yes. Yes. I
Right?
think you're right.
It can catch, and it could have a very real thing, right?
Yes.
Uh, but yeah, you're right. Like, somebody's smell, the all the different mannerisms, and like the adjusting, and then the coming into it, and
Hmm.
that being a process, and the ritual of that. Oh
Hmm.
yeah, and like really contending with somebody in a very
Hmm.
physical way, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And
Uh,
also, yeah, and the possibility of physical contact, right?
that's right.
It's
That's right.
so substantiating.
That's right. And and in a bivalent way, right? Because the possibility of physical contact can mean threat of injury. It can mean dominance.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, it can mean death. But it can also mean.
yeah,
Well, again, I'm thinking of this in terms of the eros, right? That when
yeah,
eros becomes couched in that philia practice, it can veer. It suddenly, when you're in proximity to somebody,
huh,
its potential is unbounded,
yeah,
right? So yes, I mean, on the one hand, you can end up fought and dead, right? And on the other hand, you can end up the capacity for closeness, obviously, between people in physical
yeah,
proximity is also amplified,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the boundaries that are
Hmm.
put around the capacity for the relationship and its evolution at any given time
Huh,
are instantly appreciated by your mutual physicality,
right.
right? Whether it be the danger of the possibility,
Yeah,
or the promise of deepening the relationship itself.
yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah, good stuff.
So anyway, there's a lot of strands here, and maybe we'll want to pick this thread up again, because I know that for me, that I'm not even sure what a lot of this means. It's just sort of coming out in
Well,
spurts. But there's something to all of this, I think, that's worth thinking more about,
yeah.
and trying to tighten up.
Hmm.
Certainly, I feel compelled now that
Hmm.
this is all coming up, to try and give it a little bit more geometry.
Yeah, totally. And it's also, it'd be interesting to think about, like, what happens when we do virtual, right? And we can get into that. What does it mean? I heard somebody talk about, like, them being in a virtual meeting. He, and he apparently there's places that you go and then you meet up and they're their avatars, right?
Yeah.
And he was talking about where he was talking to people, and then somebody came up to him and says, "Hey, have you seen this other thing? Like, no one knows about it." Right? And he goes into some room and he takes them to this, and there's all these people in this other room. And there was a sense of just where, like, it was
I'm imagining it right now.
how easily it could translate. But then again, there's that quality of you take those things off, right? It's probably going to be even more intense. Yeah.
Mhm.
So there is a sense of, like, especially if you think, 'cause to me, this has just plays so much about what I've been fascinated with. And so where one of the things that Heidegger just really speaks to me is, like, he's like, look, like, Gestalt, right? Das Man, right? The Gestalt, the standing reserve, right? Isn't ontic, it's ontological. And so this is, I think, what I'm here, like, this is where it goes, like, well, when we say, but it is going to go that way, it is going to drift that way, that's where you really get it. Like, even if you line up the things and you show how awful it is and you get well informed, that, like, there's a movement of an understanding that's going on, right? And seeing its uncanniness and its weirdness is part of the thing about confronting it, right? But,
Absolutely.
like, in other words, it's beyond an action and a moral stance, right? That's the thing. That's the thing about it. But it has me think about, like, well,
Mm.
okay, on some level, like, if we look at if, like, we're the standing reserve as well, and that's one of the things that my understanding of when Heidegger was talking about, like, kind of what makes this the age of technology and not kind of subject object, being as subjects and objects, right? But instead being as that which is waiting, like that which is available to be excavated, extracted, and ordered, right, for its own sake, right? That goes all the way down to even the way that we conceive ourselves, the way that we conceive relationships, the way we contextualize things and fashion things, that's the basis upon which it makes sense to even consider giving that up, right? It's just there'd be enough coarseness. So there's a quality of, like, if I look at it that way, there's a way in which where you're basically saying, like, no, this is sacred, right? This is sacred, literally, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that it can't be extracted, right? It can't be optimized, right? And,
Yes.
like, sucked out, right? Like, it can be utilized, but, like, it but more like the windmill.
It has to grow. It has to still grow in the wild. It has
Yeah,
to still grow in the wild.
yeah,
That's kind
totally,
of how I think about it, right? It has,
totally,
and I think about it in terms of the dialogos too, right? It
yeah,
has to grow. For it to
right,
grow truly, it has to grow in the wild, and that doesn't mean that it has to sit. That doesn't mean that there's no agency involved, and that doesn't mean that we can't gather to
right,
cultivate it.
right,
But somehow it must remain untamed,
yeah,
and I think that's the great predicament. It's an irony of the problem in that, we're trying, and I'm certainly a full and willing participate in the project of trying to understand the conditions that conduce the process such that they might be replicated and reproducible and recollectible. I think that's important because it's such a meaningful and sacred practice, but somehow that also needs to be harmonized with the necessity of the untamed wilderness
yeah,
that contains within it those inexhaustible features
yeah,
that remain and dwell in the margins of what we can organize and cohere at any given moment in time. The danger, the unspeakable dangers that lurk in the mysteries of physical proximity and the confrontations therein cannot be dispensed from the process because they are implicit to its sacredness.
right, right, totally. So there's the edge of the fire of the light of the,
Yeah, That's right. The darkness is part of what makes the fire sacred. The darkness must be present. The
Yeah.
darkness must be present. And these campfires are wonderfully warming, but the virtual campfire, it might be said, contains too little of the darkness.
Right. Totally.
Because there is danger, there is risk,
Right.
but the risk perhaps is not as sufficiently embodied as it is when dialogos is physically manifest and symbolized in space.
Yeah. Interesting. Really interesting. Yeah, imagine like, the Alcibiades and Socrates like meeting on Zoom.
He would have, Alcibiades would have just hit end, and that would have been it. That's the thing too. By God, it's so obvious, right? But that's the thing. It's so you can elude confrontation so easily this way, right? Like if you when you, and we're talking about this like as an ointment that you surrender yourself, that traps you, like the covenant that characterizes you and enfolds you into its narrativity. Like when you pass somebody on the street, somebody and they stop you and they say hi. I mean, none but the most antisocial person would just keep walking, heedless of the gesture, right? Someone stops you and goes, "Hey, guy, I haven't seen you." I mean, you're not just going to keep walking and ignore the person, right? I mean, maybe some people would, but that's like a fraction of the population. But you can't quite do that, right? Because suddenly you're, as you said so eloquently, you're now conversed, you're enfolded into a shared universe immediately. And now that you're always already there, you have to cope with the reality of being there in conversation with that person. You cannot simply opt out in the way that you can opt out like this. And so again, the untamed nature of it, again, the danger, again, the risk is so much more imminent. It's so much more felt and lived through, because you cannot simply opt out of it. So the consignment of oneself to the rhythms of whatever is happening is much more unavoidable, right? When it's simply foist on you in physical proximity. You're right, because Socrates, when he hails, right, like Socrates just ensnares his interlocutors because they can't bring themselves to walk. I mean, some of them do, right? But most of them can't bring themselves to just walk away from him, because his presence, his presence is so seductive that it's dangerous. And again, it's his beauty. It's like the Rilke quote that John talks about a lot, about how beauty is an angel, a terrifying angel that will damn near kill you. That both the terror and the rapture are made manifest when the dialogos is present. And it's precisely the loss of agency under the gaze of its seduction that truly inaugurates you into the practice. And that's it, right? That's part of it, is that it's one thing for us to come volitionally to this and engage with one another. But it's another thing to have it erupt suddenly and disruptively into your world and transfigure your world around you unwittingly, because suddenly you came across the presence of beauty that, you know, could not help but to change you.
Yeah. Right.
And that happens when we encounter people in the world.
Yeah, that does not come with a set of options.
It does not, and it can't, arguably, right? It can't. That's the whole point, is that it can't.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot there's so much that's here with us. There's so much that we can exemplify here. But there's also so much that we can exemplify precisely because of its absence.
Yeah.
Much of that is absent from this conversation that you and I are having. All of those things that we're describing, right? This arena between you and I right now has sufficient breadth that it can accommodate an imagination of all that it lacks, which is precisely the continuity, I think, between the virtual dialogue and that dialogue in presentia, because the virtual dialogue has a capacious imagination. And I think by its imagination, it affines itself to its physical correspondent.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think that it should be in reference to its embodied nature, and not as a way of substituting its embodied nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Interesting. Have you thought much about I've been thinking lately about Plato, of how so he wrote all that, right? Right? Have you thought much about what it was like to be Plato? Like, in what it would sit down to write those because I just don't think it's reasonable to say, oh my God, it's been 2.5 hours. Jesus, I have somebody waiting in the
Oh, really? Oh, okay. Well, we'll put a pin in that then, shall we?
Right on. It's been a really good conversation.
It has. Yeah, it has.
Yeah.
Hui. Okay. Well, okay. I'll send this to you. I'll send this to you shortly.
Okay. If you have
let me know. Let me know where I should drop it.
Yeah. Do you have Dropbox?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, my friend.
Okay, my friend. This is great.
Just like, hang on a second. Let's just like pretend like we're going back in the distance, right?
Getting up from the couch, stretching.
If you don't want anything, don't forget your coat.
Putting my now emptied glass back on the table, because it's sure empty by now, right. And saying thank you for your great hospitality.
Yes. Oh, you're welcome.
As always.
Really. Sorry, the house was so messy.
Oh, it's okay. Mine's worse. And I'll swing by again next week and rap on your door.
All right. Talk to you later, my friend. Bye.
Okay. Take care.